graduate of Kutztown High School, right? And college, right? Who has some interesting information and artifacts on the carriage era. So I'm excited to hear about that era. I just remember ringing bells as a little girl, and I saw you brought in quite a few of them, so I'm anxious to hear more about them.
All right.
And welcome so much. Let's give Ron a nice welcome.
A little bit of background how I come to compose this talk. I'm a member of the Pennsylvania Society of Archaeology, and in one of their meetings the president was saying, oh, they were looking for speakers. And I thought, and they like historical type programs, of course, so I thought maybe they were interested in a talk about carriages. I knew that 40, 45 years ago I had collected a lot of information about carriage industry and that, so I offered to give a talk to them. Well, I started putting this talk together, and my wife actually found my notes from 40, 45 years ago. And let me tell you, that was a shocking revelation to me, because not only had I forgotten a lot, but what I remembered, a lot of that was wrong. So anyway, that's how I come to prepare this talk, and I also gave it to the Hamburg Area Historical Society, so this is my third run through it, but I've made some minor changes. So we're going to talk about the horse and carriage era, and there's a couple caveats to that. It's, at this point, the emphasis is going to be on what I call light, non-commercial vehicles. It would be the vehicles that the every common day person would use. And we're going to emphasize the Hamburg, Kutztown, and the surrounding areas. And the basis for our knowledge is from our, which I say our because it's from my and my wife's perspective, where we ended up being collectors, but we also ran a carriage restoration business for about 20 years. So the talk today is going to consist of, first off, a PowerPoint presentation with a couple of topics here. There's a short opening spoof that I'm sure you'll enjoy. And then we'll make an attempt to define the local carriage area, a little bit about the carriage industry, some information about the carriage industry in Hamburg and Kutztown, and they're intimately connected by the way, as you'll find out. Some backgrounds about the business that we ran, which was called Cinnamon Carriage Shop. My wife's name was Cindy. And then I'll show you pictures of our collection of horse-drawn vehicles that we have. And then we're going to finish. Oh, these are some of the references for the materials that went into this talk. There's the Centennial History of Kutztown, in a bunch of different places. And then the last part of the talk, I'll go through all the stuff that I brought in here for show and tell. This is the one that I start this off of here.
This is so romantic.
Well, it's about to get a little bit more romantic. A little candlelight and a little good life. Did you just go barbecue?
Oh, no. Now, there is some reality to that. I can remember driving the horse and the sleigh out in the field, and every once in a while you do get a whiff of warm air. There's a little bit of odor to it. Okay, enough of the levity. Defining the horse and carriage era. Prior to 1840, most of your land transportation was dominated by commercial enterprises, stage lines, and the railroads. In fact, it wasn't until 1841 that the U.S. Congress made it legal for individuals to own a carriage. And that was only then if you had a proper license. So now you know where the licensing to drive a car, own and drive a car comes from. It goes way back. However, in the 1840s, by the way, I don't think anybody has any trouble hearing me, do you?
No.
Okay, I talk pretty loud, especially when I get excited. In the 1840s, however, all your carriages were hand-built, basically one at a time, and they were generally too expensive for the common-day person to own one. In fact, in the whole United States, there were only 1,000 carriage builders. But by the 1890s, that changed markedly. There were now up to 8,000 carriage factories that were actually mass-producing carriages. And then the prices dropped a whopping amount from maybe $500 a common carriage down to the $50 to $100 range. And here's an ad from an 1897 Sears Roebuck catalog where you could get a nice one-seat carriage with lamps for 2 people for $58, and if you paid in cash, you got it for $56.25. And if you wanted a special B-grade carriage, you could even get that for under $40. So the prices of carriages dropped markedly, but then unfortunately by 1905, the horse carriage industry was already in major decline due to the oncoming, what they called then the motorized carriage. But although as late as 1935, there were still 3,000 carriage factories in the United States, but they were mostly supplying vehicles for rural use. So my definition of the horse and carriage era for locally non-commercial vehicles, it began slowly in the 1850s. It steadily built up to a peak in the 1880s, 1890s, and then locally it abruptly ends 1915. So we're going to start our story out actually in Kutztown here. Local carriage industry. 1837, Richard Miller established a shop in Kutztown. His original shop was at the corner of Main and White Oak Street where the Farmers Bank is. That was the original shop, and originally it was a repair shop only. Kutztown was on what was called the Easton Road that went from Reading to Easton, and the commercial vehicles needed a repair shop to repair their commercial breakdowns. So Richard Miller set up his shop. He did his apprentice work in Lancaster County and in Berks County at Blatt's shop down in Reading. I already mentioned this original shop was there at Main and White Oak. In 1840, he built a new shop also located on Main Street up at Saunders Alley, and that's now where the Turk's Hardware is. And Richard Miller's home was across the street, maybe 2 or 3 doors down the hill at that point. In 1865, he partnered with his son Charles, and he began operating as R. Miller and Sons. In 1876, I know that there were at least 2 other carriage building shops in Kutztown. There was one operated by Smith down on the lower end of Walnut Street, where it met Greenwich Street. There was another one by Wagner, and he was down also on Main Street. When you went down the hill across the Saucony Creek, it was on the left side there, across from, there's a hotel out there, Bale Street or something like that now?
Basin Street.
Basin Street, yeah. It was somewhere over on the other side of the street there. Unfortunately, in 1915, Richard's son Charles, well, maybe not unfortunate for them, he obtained a Ford agency, and very suddenly the carriage shop suddenly became a showroom for cars, Ford cars. So in 1915, that was the end of the carriage industry in Kutztown for the most part. In fact, I think Miller's shop was the last one in business at that time. Now, Now we switch to Hamburg. 1867, William Scott established the carriage shop in Hamburg. Now look at this, this is 30 years difference in time here. William Scott actually apprenticed at Miller's shop here in Kutztown. Scott's initial shop and home were located on the northwest corner of State and Peach Alley. If you go into Hamburg and you go down the hill on State Street, cross through 4th Street, on the right, if you know where the Windsor Press is, right behind the alley of Windsor Press is where this shop would have been. After William's death in 1902, his son, forget what his son's name is now. This one was Charles. I forget, anyway, I have it later on. Anyway, after William died, his son, whose last name was also Scott, partnered with someone named Kammerer, and they moved the shop further up the alley to where E.S. Savage now has his trucking business. That was originally a brickyard, and then it became a carriage shop. There were 3 other shops, carriage shops in Hamburg. One by Ramig and another one by Siegfried. I don't know anything about them beyond that. There was a 4th shop operated by Christian Baum, who operated the C. Baum and Miller. And that shop was located where Hecky's Sub Shop is now in Hamburg on State Street. In 1885, the 3 carriage shops together employed about 30 people. Now these carriage shops, like any one carriage shop, did not have enough work to keep an upholsterer busy. So all 3 shops would like share the same upholsterer. Same thing for the painters, the pinstripers, and that. So they shared a lot of employees, but 1 week's output from the Baum shop and the Scott shop was 11 vehicles. And then the Scott and Kammerer shop, that also closed again in 1915, the same year that Charles' son, Charles Miller, shut the shop down in Kutztown. Already mentioned this, that they shared a lot of employees. There were also a lot of other supporting shops. Obviously the ones that made wheels, the ones that worked on the ironwork, harnesses for the horses, and of course you also had the wagon builders, and then you had the people that were the dealers, the ones that sold the products that these carriage shops made. So one point I want to make here is the difference between these 2 dates. Kutztown was on the Eastern Road that went from Reading via Kutztown to Easton. That Easton Road was completed very early in our state history, back in 1755 already. Kutztown had no other access for transportation. They didn't have a river nearby, they didn't have a canal, and they had limited railroad access because the main line actually went through the Lyons-Tofton area. So Kutztown's transportation industry was defined by the road, the Eastern Road. In the case of Hamburg, they lived on a pretty big road too. It was called the Center Turnpike. It went from Reading via Hamburg up to Sunbury, but it was completed much later in the state history in 1814, and that it was called a turnpike because it actually was a toll road. And it was a toll road effectively until 1855, although they had stopped collecting tolls at a lot of places. And technically it didn't end until 1885 when the railroad assumed all of the possessions of what was the Center Turnpike Commission, and they bought all those possessions because they wanted the right-of-ways to put in the railroads. And it's cut off a little bit here, but so Hamburg had a couple. They, of course, had the canal systems that went in the 1820s, because of this blocking some of it. Hamburg had the Schuylkill River Canal that came in the 1820s, 1850s. They got railroads. In the case of the railroad in Hamburg, the main line was on the west side of the river, but there was a spur coming into Hamburg. So I think the reason for the late start of the Hamburg carriage industry was because they relied more on the canal and the railroads. Kutztown didn't have that option. It only had, the Eastern Road. And that's why Richard Miller ended up setting a repair shop very early in history. Now there was, this is just some more details on William Scott. I had a lot of information on William Scott because I had one of his vehicles in my collection at one time. William Scott actually was born in Port Carbon, Schuylkill County. His father Robert immigrated from Ireland in 1795. In 1850, he moved the family to Hamburg. William Scott, the carriage builder in Hamburg, left school at an early age to learn his trade from Richard Miller here in Kutztown. William fought in the Civil War, as did his two brothers, and they all survived the Civil War, and after the Civil War they came to live and work in Berks County. I already mentioned this. 1869, William Scott married Emma Faust. Here's a family picture of William and Emma and their 8 children. His original residence was down on the lower end of State Street, but he later on bought a home up on 4th Street. Here's a picture of the home on 4th Street. This is a picture, I think, taken by Google or something like that, the one that makes all the maps. Yeah, Google Maps. This is a picture I pulled off the website from them. This home is immaculately maintained. An artist lives there now. If you go by there at night, there's candles in all of the windows. It's lit up nicely. But that was Richard Miller, William Scott rather's home later on. Okay, his son's name was Samuel Scott. In 1902, when William died, Samuel took over the business. He partnered with James Camera, and then they operated as Scott and Camera. However, at some point, Samuel Scott left the business and he went to work for the Horn Motor Truck shops that were also in Hamburg. And then in 1915, James Camera auctioned off the business. There was a latecomer to the local carriage industry in the Hamburg, Kutztown area. It actually started in 1898 with William Hahn, who set a shop up in Leesport. 2 years later, he moved to Hamburg and began operating as the Hamburg Carriage Works. Hahn's shop was located on the south end of 3rd Street in Hamburg in a really huge building that's now occupied by KMX International. This outfit does heavy hauling of real big pieces of equipment and stuff like that. He later operated as William G. Hahn brother. In 1907, this shop, however, started building motorized trucks. And from 1913 to 1920, they operated as the Hahn Motor Truck and Wagon. 1920, they dropped the and wagon, and they operated up to the Depression as Hahn Motor Trucks. But the Depression was not very kind to Hahn Motor Trucks. In 1932, they reorganized as Hahn Motors Incorporated, and they were in business up until 1988, building Hahn fire trucks in Hamburg. Here's a couple pictures of dates on trucks that they remade. I remember when we moved to Hamburg, about them still building fire trucks there. Here's an interesting little side note. This is the emblem that they put on there, a lot of their trucks, Hahn Motors Incorporated, Hamburg. Why do you think they had a rooster in their emblem?
Because they were cocky.
Well, that's close. You're right. In German, a Hahn is a rooster. You get an A for the night. I don't know what it's worth. As I said, William Scott his son Samuel worked at Hahn Motor Trucks, and what he did there, He was a painter, a gold leaf detailer, and he did upholstering. In fact, many of the former carriage shop workers in Hamburg worked at the Hahn Motor Truck shops then, because they were in business for a long time. Oops. Now, a little bit, let's change gears now and talk a little bit about my background, myself and my wife. I'm an engineer. I worked in the fiber optics business at Bell Laboratories. I had offices in the Western Electric locations, both in Reading and Allentown. A lifelong hobby of mine has been astronomy. I'm a member of the Lehigh Valley Amateur Astronomical Society and the Berks County Amateur Astronomical Society. And through marriage, I got involved with horses. I didn't have a choice. My wife is a former art teacher out of the Blue Mountain School District, and we got married. Her dowry was 3 horses. That's how I got involved with horses. And we did run a former business, as I mentioned earlier, called Horse and Carriage Shop. And I think the next slide is a little bit about that. We also became collectors of many things related to the horse and carriage industry, and that's basically some of the show and tell things that I brought along here. A little bit about the business that we ran. For 20 years, we were exhibitors at the Kutztown Folk Festival. We had a tent there called the Carriage Maker Tent, where we showed some of our carriages and some of these accessories. And I was also the farrier there. For 20 years, I did live horseshoeing demonstrations twice a day at the Folk Festival. Over there at the end of the table here is my horseshoeing box and paraphernalia. I only did horseshoeing part-time for friends and neighbors, but I got to do a lot of it, nevertheless. We also did some carriage exhibits and horseshoeing at some local festivals. Some of you might remember a Kutztown native, Howard Geisinger, ran the Weekend Farm Festival up at Kempton, up at the WK&S Railroad, up in that area. He had a real neat festival up there. It was just one weekend of the year. And then another Kutztown native, Harold Schaefer, ran a small festival up in the Duncannon area that we participated in. My wife and I were lifetime members of the Carriage Association of America, which is an offshoot of the International Carriage Association. Most of our business came to us through this Carriage Association affiliation. In fact, in the late 1970s, my wife spoke at the International Carriage Convention in Toronto. And she was known in the industry as the girl from Pennsylvania. We were also members of a local club called the Red Rose Horse and Pony Club, and that club was the antithesis of the Carriage Association. This was a local club. We would get together on a Sunday afternoon at somebody's farm, and we'd go for a ride with our carriages. We'd get anywhere from 6 to 30 carriages for a drive, and we'd go like for a 10-mile drive with our carriages. I don't even know if this club exists anymore, but I'd be hard-pressed to think that they really do exist yet, because nowadays, with all the traffic on the roads, I don't think your automotive traffic would tolerate 30 carriages in a row going down the road. I mean, we used to have police escorts at some intersections to get us across the roads and stuff like that. What did Sinron Carriage Shop do? We were in what was called the trimming industry of antique carriages, and it was for private collectors, most of them from the Carriage Association and of course museums. And we had 2 aspects to our work. We did some upholstery using fine broadcloths and wool mohair materials. But our main business was a niche industry where we did the recovery of fenders and dashes in either in real patent leather or imitation patent leather. And I have the next slide here shows you what I mean by that. Here's an example of a pretty fancy carriage. Here's the dashboard. This has a metal frame that's covered with patent leather, and here's the fender on the carriage. So people would either deliver the frames to us or ship them, and I quite often had to do straightening and welding and stuff like that. And then my wife did the recovery in patent leather.
We had a two-seater.
So that was our main line of business. We also did some upholstery. One of the vehicles that I say we, my wife, she did the work. This is a brome. The whole interior of this carriage, every surface was covered in some sort of cloth. I mean, you had the carpet on the floor, you had the pull-down shades, you had a lift-up window, not just the cushions in the back seat, but even the side door panels were covered in cloth, and of course the driver's cushion here was covered in cloth, and here would have been the fender covered in patent leather. So we did some upholstery, but as I said, most of our business was just the patent leather work on fenders. We also did some upholstery on sleighs, and that was usually for pleasure for local people. If it was for a museum, it would have been reupholstered in mohair. If it was for a local person for everyday use, we covered in something like naga hide, something more durable.
Where was your business?
Where we live, we live between Centerport and Charlottesville, west of Hamburg, out in the middle of the boonies. We had trouble, people delivering stuff to us. You know, they try and find us, and they stop somewhere and they say, oh, they have a Burnville telephone. They live over near Burnville. I got news for you. We were 8 miles from Burnville. It was a weird area. We had a Hamburg telephone. We had 3 post offices closer to where we lived than our real post office that we got mail from. So people had trouble finding us. Okay, as collectors, we collected lots of paraphernalia that I've listed there. I'll go through that in show and tell. And some of the items that I have are rather unique. Maybe you'll do better at identifying some of them than some of these other people. But we also became collectors of carriages and sleighs. So the next couple slides, I'm going to show you pictures of the vehicles that are in our collection. And we limited our collection to lightweight vehicles that were pulled by 1 or 2 horses, with a special emphasis on locally made vehicles whenever possible. So we'll start out with, oh, before we get into that, a little bit of identifying carriages and how old they are. You look at the wheels. The wheels either have what's called a staggered spoke hub or something called a Sarvin hub. This is the staggered spoke hub. It's a large wooden hub. The spokes are mortised and tenon into that hub, and they're offset here. 1 in, 1 out, 1 in, 1 out. That in and out arrangement formed like a little triangle that supported the wheel felloe out here. You can't date them whether they're on iron or rubber, because William Goodyear already patented vulcanized rubber as early as 1844. So it was the option of the carriage owner if he wanted to pay extra for rubber or if he wanted to be on iron. So you can't really date them whether they're on rubber or iron, but if they have a staggered spoke hub, you know it's a very early vehicle as opposed to a vehicle that has a Sarvin hub. The Sarvin hub was patented in 1860, but it didn't become popular until later on. But this hub had a much smaller wooden central piece. The spokes were still mortised and tenon into the wood, but then you had this metal flange on either side that was through riveted to it. This wheel was much easier to make, and it was much stronger than the staggered spoke hub. So this took over the industry very quickly, and in fact the Amish are still making wheels with this style to this day. So if it's got a Sarvin hub, you know it's probably 1870 or later. If it's got a staggered spoke wheel, it's earlier than 1870. And it doesn't matter whether it's on rubber or iron. Okay, so we're going to start out. A lot of the pictures of the carriages I'm showing here, they're not pictures of the actual carriages that I own, because they're in a big shed and a barn stuffed with other stuff, and can't get out and take pictures. But this is one of them. We'll start out with two-wheeled carts. Another name for them was gigs. This is what I call a training cart. It's bare bones, one horse, small seat for one or two people to sit on. This particular cart does have staggered spoke hub on rubber. It was actually made by Miller out of Goshen, New York. We have a whole bunch of other carts, some horse size, some pony size. Here's an example of a much fancier cart. This is called what I would call a pleasure driving cart. This specific style is called a Meadowbrook cart. It's of course on a Sarvin hub, again on rubber, but here you have a wooden dash, little wooden fender. It's much fancier. The Meadowbrook that we have does not have a maker's tag, but the Amish are making these today yet. You know, you can go down to Lancaster County to New Holland area, and the shops down there, and you can buy a cart like this from them now. One unique cart that we have in our collection is this high-wheel racing cart. This is a picture of one. It's not a picture of mine, but you had a real light frame. The driver sat here, out here the stirrups, so he straddled the back of the horse. Staggered spoke hub here, but the hub is very dainty. The wheel spokes are real thin. The felloe here is real thin. That wheel is actually as high as my chin here. The wheels are really high. And this was what was called a racing bike or a racing gig or cart. And here's a picture of how the driver sat on this thing. So you remember the video I started early? Well, this guy here was sitting real close to the axle. Changing tune to four-wheeled vehicles. One of the vehicles in our collection is called a Jenny Lind. This was a dainty ladies driving vehicle. On four wheels, a very short wheelbase, two people, nice curtains to drop down, a little bit of a fringe. It's on a Sarvin hub, so it's a later vehicle, you know, maybe 1880s, 1890s, but it was a dainty ladies driving vehicle. And the reason it was called a Jenny Lind, I guess it was named after the 1850s opera singer that was in the United States. And we get to what I call common folding top buggies. Every now and then I see an advertisement locally in the paper for a doctor's buggy for sale. They call all these things doctor's buggies. I got news for you. There were not that doggone many doctors around that there's this many doctor's buggies around. These were just your common folding top buggies that the everyday average family owned. I have a couple of these in my collection. I'm very fortunate. I have one that has a tag on it from Richard Miller and Sons out of Kutztown. We know Richard Miller's son started business with, his son went into business with the founder in 1875. They shut down in 1915, so we know the date for that. I have another one that comes out of Boyertown from F.H. Hartman, and that one I can date bracket a lot closer. This shop actually started as Strunk and Fisher. Strunk retired, and then Hartman came into the business with Fisher, and then Fisher retired, and Hartman operated by himself starting in 1893. And then in 1911, the business was reorganized into the Boyertown Carriage Works. So that one I can date even much more closely. But you'll see a lot of these common folding top buggies around. And of course they have Sarvin hubs because they date from the 1880s, 1890s, maybe even a little bit later. In our collection we have a buckboard. If you look back on the carriage here the body had springs front and rear, and the whole body was sprung on the axles. On the buckboard here, the body of the vehicle is mounted directly on the axle, and you only had a spring supporting the seat that you sat on. So this is your early forerunner of a pickup truck. Our buckboard is Sarvin hub like shown here, but ours is on iron, not on rubber like this picture. But we have the same type of rail in the back on ours, just like this. Ours does not have a maker's tag, but I have a note here to remind. This is the vehicle that we used to drive in the Red Rose Horse and Pony Club drives, the buckboard. Another vehicle in our collection is this spindle seat runabout. It's called a spindle seat because the seat here has spindles. This is another dainty ladies driving vehicle. It's an early one. It's on staggered spokes on rubber. This is not our vehicle, but it's very similar. Ours does not have a tag, but what differentiates ours actually in the back here has a metal post that goes up the back, and it has a parasol on the top of it. So it was again another dainty ladies driving vehicle. Now this is a picture of one of the carriages that we own. I call it a fringe top Surrey. Here's a flat canopy roof with a fringe, 2-seat. It's on staggered spokes, so it's an early vehicle. It actually comes out of Bridgeport, Connecticut. This is the mare that we used to drive. This is myself and my wife in a much earlier lifetime. This vehicle did not have good upholstery, so I had the seats covered with lap robes like the one that I had. In fact, I think that lap robe there is the one on the back seat. We did not hire out to do weddings, but we did weddings for friends and neighbors. This wedding here, this was my best friend from town here, John Beaver. I went to school here at Kutztown, and I met my wife up at the college. I was in the physics department, she was in the art department, so we never had any classes together, but we met at church. And one day, we were over at John's house, and he invited us over because he wanted to introduce us to his fiance. So John said, he comes out and he says, "I'd like to introduce you to my fiance," and this cute looking redhead steps out, and immediately my wife says, "Hi, Jeannie." Turns out John went to school at Penn State, and my wife and Jeannie come from up in that area, Penn State. They lived west of Lewistown in a little one-horse town called McVaytown. If you drive through there now, you blink, you miss it. So here's two Kutztown boys that married two girls from McVaytown. What a coincidence. The horse here is decked out with, here's where the saddle chimes go. Here's a saddle chime. When we did these weddings and I put that saddle chime on there, it was fine if you were out in the country where it was open air. If you were in town where there were buildings, the sound from that bell would echo off the buildings, and it would just drive you nuts. And we had lamps on the carriage. In fact, it might have actually been these lamps here that were on the carriage. And of course, we had it decked out with bells. And this is the little Abbey mare that we used to drive around. This horse was almost not scared of anything. She wasn't scared of tractor trailers, motorcycles, cars, even gas tractors she wasn't scared of, but she did not like diesel tractors. And one day we were driving our buckboard, and we were about a mile from our place. We just come over the hill, ready to go down the hill, and here's a diesel tractor coming up the hill, and I figured, we are in trouble. There was a bank on the right side about 4 foot high, and this silly horse hitched to the buckboard, jumped up on that bank, was thrashing around, trying to pull the buckboard up on the bank. The diesel tractor went by us. I calmed her down, got her down off the bank, re-hitched her to the buckboard. The only thing she tore was the strap here that holds the bridging strap to the shaft, which is your brakes, basically, on the carriage. And I happened to have a piece of baler twine with me, so I tied that back down, and then we drove her home, no problem. But she did not like diesel tractors. We even had her down in Philadelphia during the bicentennial in the old City Sunday Parade where we were following a band, you know, and all the people around. That didn't bother her, but diesel tractors she didn't like, yeah.
What is it that defines that as a Surrey? Is it the flat top?
Yeah, well, you could have, I don't really know. This is called this flat top with the fringes was one type of Surrey. There was another type of Surrey that had a folding top, like what I showed you on that Miller and the Boyertown bogies. They also had folding top Surreys like that. I think it was just two equal size seats. This, of course, had leather fenders and a leather dash, too. Beyond that, I don't know what.
I guess I've heard other terms too, like a phaeton and a brougham.
Well, a phaeton was that. Remember the vehicle I showed you there, where I
Sears
defined the dashes?
Yeah.
That was called a phaeton. A fancy folding top buggy was also called a phaeton. There are lots of different names for these carriages. If you look through the old catalogs, you'd be shocked at all the names.
Whatever the marketing department wanted to call
Yeah,
it.
I guess. The last four-wheel drive vehicle that I have in my collection is, one name for it would be a light curtain rockaway. If it was owned by a private family, it was called a light curtain rockaway. If it was a commercial vehicle, it was called a depot wagon. This particular vehicle that I own is on staggered spoke on iron. This one is, the picture here is on rubber, mine's on iron. And mine was actually made by the Beal Carriage Works out of Reading. And they made mostly commercial vehicles, so maybe the more proper name for this, I should call it a depot wagon. It might have been a commercial vehicle. This has what's called a cut under body. If you look back here if you look back here on the Surrey, when you turn this, you could only turn so sharp till the wheel hit the body of the carriage. The vehicle here, this is cut under. This wheel actually went in under there, and you could turn so sharp till this actual wheel actually hit the perch pole here on the carriage. In fact, it turns so sharp that it literally pivots right on the rear wheel there. So it was made for city driving. I think mine might have been a commercial vehicle because this seat here actually rotates 180 degrees so that you could actually carry 3 passengers in the wagon. And if it really was a depot wagon, it would have been used to take people like from the hotel to the train station or to the stagecoach stop or something like that, back and forth. But I like it because, again, it's a local-made vehicle and it could have been used by the common man, although this was a rather fancy one. Then we go into sleighs. We have one farm sled in our collection. Here's the closest picture I could find of it. It's basically a wooden box on 2 runners, and it's got a small seat. I call it a market sleigh or farm sleigh. Ours does not have a folding top on it, but you get the idea of what it looked like. This picture I pulled out of a book written by Sue Green, who's the librarian with the Carriage Association at the museum down in Kentucky. Actually, Sue Green is a native of Schuylkill County, and she and my wife, collaborated a lot on restoration projects on carriages. This sleigh, when I bought it, I was told it was made by someone named Merkel from Virginville. I've tried to locate anybody named Merkel around that area, but I've never been successful in really identifying where that was. We have a bunch of common sleighs in our collection. The most common type you'll see are called Portland cutters. These are characterized by basically straight wooden panels on the side. Most of them even have a straight panel in the back. This one has a little bit of an arch. This was your earlier style of pleasure sleigh. One of them that we own has a tag on it from Chambers out of Germantown, Pennsylvania. Here's shaft chimes on the sleigh. Here the shaft chimes are on the bottoms. The ones I have here mount on the top of the shaft, but the same location. And then a more desirable sleigh is what was called the Albany Cutter, which was a later style pleasure sleigh, also known as swell body sleighs. Here all the wood panels are curved. It's curved around the back, even up and down sideways. The bow has a very pronounced arch to it. This is a picture of a fully restored Albany sleigh where somebody actually redid the entire painting, and then we did the upholstery in the sleigh. This would have been done in red mohair with pulled buttons on the cushion seat and the back. We have two Albany cutters in our collection. The one Albany cutter we own, all the painting on it is original and really good shape. We just had to reupholster it. And to show you how good the painting is, this is the cameo that's on the back of the sleigh. This cameo is about that big around on the back of the sleigh. And on the front of the sleigh, out on the front here, there's another small cameo. The one on the back was that real young lady. The one on the back is an elderly lady with a fancy hat on it. So I don't know, was the one his wife and the other one the daughter? I'm not sure. But, so we have a real nice Albany cutter that we put that in. We've gotten a lot of prizes with that, taking it to shows, because it's very original, except of course for the upholstery. The painting on it is immaculate. Okay, here's another Albany cutter that we owned. This one's in the rough. The upholstery's totally moth-eaten or mouse and rat-eaten. The only thing that's there is the coconut hair roll that went around there. But the neat thing about this was made by the William Scott Carriage Works out of Hamburg. This was in our collection, and I guess about the year 2000, one day I got a telephone call from this man here, Greg Scott, who was a descendant of William Scott, the guy that made the sleigh. And he had found out somehow that I owned a sleigh that was made by his great-grandfather. And he wanted to know if he could come and look at it. Well, I explained to him that it was upstairs in the barn, but it was up on a shelf that I had built, and there was a lot of other junk packed around it. But he came over with 3 of his cousins, and between these 3 men and myself, we got it out, and here it's in the front of the barn here. They're standing around it, and they were very pleased, to take a picture of that. And I thought I'd be pressured by them to buy this. But I guess I thoroughly had them convinced that, number one, this was an Albany cutter sleigh, which is the more desirable type. It was locally made, so that's what really made it attractive to me. And, it was in very good shape, too, other than the upholstery, of course. So they didn't pressure me into buying it. And then one day, 12 years later, I get a telephone call from Greg's wife, Terry, and she says, Greg is having his 60th birthday, and I'm wondering if you would sell me the Scott sleigh for his 60th birthday. And she assured me that they would take very good care of it, because I wasn't going to sell it to somebody that sets it out in their yard and lets it rot away. And she said their intent was to restore it, and she said, within the family, we have a lot of experience restoring vehicles. And she invited my wife and I down to Lancaster County to show us some of the restoration work that they did on vehicles. So, and one of the cousins here, I don't know which one of them was actually a cabinet maker who was real good at doing woodwork. So we went down to Lancaster, and this is what Greg's wife, Terry, her father, this is what the father restores. That's a Duesenberg. I think it's like a 1928 Duesenberg. Immaculately restored. I mean, really immaculate. We drove all over around Lancaster in this thing that day. Like, that's me sitting in the car there, and I think my wife's in the back seat. I didn't drive it, of course. He drove it. I wouldn't want to drive it around Lancaster. But this thing's immaculately restored. These wooden door panels, you couldn't even tell they were wood. So, all right, they had us convinced. You know, I know what it's like to have something that's within your family, because I have furniture from both my mother's and my dad's grandparents. We have furniture from them, so we decided to sell the sleigh to them. So my wife and I put a price on the sleigh. If they met it, we'd be very happy. If they didn't, we'd be very happy to keep the sleigh. So here's when we actually delivered the sleigh to them down in Lancaster County. Here's Greg and his wife Terry and Cindy and myself. So I no longer own the Scott sleigh. About a year ago, I answered an ad for someone that supposedly had a Scott sleigh for sale. Not very far from me, actually. I went there. It was indeed an Albany Cutter sleigh. It wasn't in near as good a shape as this. I looked at the sleigh and I didn't see the tag that said it was made by Scott Carriage Works. So I asked the lady about it. She said, "Oh, it's in a drawer in the kitchen somewhere." But I looked on the sleigh, there was never a tag on that sleigh. So short story is I didn't buy it. So I still don't have any vehicles from Hamburg in my collection, or not any longer. Okay, so that's basically my PowerPoint presentation. We'll go into the show and tell here at this point. But there's one show and tell item that my wife would not let me bring along here. And that's because, number one, it's very rare and it's very delicate. So I have a slide picture of it here that I'll show it to you. And this is a test for you. If you see, you know what it is. There's a ruler that gives you a bit of the scale size. Anybody know what that is? It's obviously a wicker piece. It's associated with the horse and carriage industry. What it's called is a wicker wheel cover. On some of your carriages, they didn't have fenders on them. So when the ladies got in and out with dresses, so that they wouldn't get their dresses wet or muddy on the fenders, you could slap that on the wheel to protect their dress. I've only seen two of these. The one we have and another one up in the museum in Shelburne. So these are very rare. But like I said, it's very delicate. Ours is fraying at some edges and stuff like that. So at this point, if you want to turn the lights on, we'll go into the show and tell. Are there any questions before?
Did the people restore the sleigh?
I don't know. I haven't talked to them since then.
All right.
I don't know.
Yeah, thought you were going to show us a picture of that.
Oh, I would have very much loved to know what they did. But I'm sure they did a good job if they did. Brian?
The wheels, you mentioned about straight and offset,
Yes.
and then the next term you used was mortise and tenon?
Well, in every case, the spokes were mortise and tenon into the wooden hub.
What does that mean?
Oh, a mortise and tenon. Come on, Brian. If a mortise and tenon joint, you have a block of wood, you put a hole in, and then you have another piece of wood that has a point that goes in that hole. That's called a mortise and tenon joint.
Oh, okay.
So I know they did standard-bred racehorsing as far as I understood in the fairgrounds. In that big,
Yeah, I don't know anything about the racing.
I was just wondering if they were using those racing carts.
Oh, probably. Well, I don't know if they were riding the horses, or if they were driving them in a carriage, or in a racing car.
They were sold.
They were driving.
They were sulky.
Okay. Sulky horse, and the sulky maybe would have been a later version of that racing gig that I showed. The racing sulkies that they have nowadays have rubber tires. In fact, the wheels are not very high either. There's that racing bike that I showed you a picture of. I mean, the wheels come up to here. All right, show and tell. I guess we'll start at this end of the table. Yeah, Evan?
We have a carriage downstairs. Do you know anything about that?
No, I didn't see it.
You have to check it
Maybe
out.
somebody will show it to me.
It's a sleigh. Yeah, it's not
In
a
fact,
carriage, it's a sleigh.
I'll stick my neck out. My wife and I would probably be interested in donating the Miller carriage that I own to the Historical Society here. If you have room to store it and you're interested.
We'd store it, we'd show it.
I'm 76, so I don't know how long I'm gonna be around, and I might as well get rid of some of my stuff. Because, tell you the truth, we have a 65-foot long shed and a 2-story bank barn filled with crap. All right. I got into horseshoeing when, like I said, we got 3 horses in a dowry, and it was just expensive to keep shoes and stuff like that. There was a local guy that came around and did the shoeing, and a real elderly guy. So at one point I asked him if he'd show me how to do the horseshoeing, and his name was Chip Mangle. Old Chip showed me how to do the horseshoeing, and I actually traveled around with him in the evenings for a couple of years doing horseshoeing. And he actually, when he could no longer do it, he actually gave me his horseshoeing apron. So this is the apron I wore for shoeing. This is the shoeing box that I had built. I have all my shoes in here, or my tools, horseshoes. If you look at a horseshoe nail here, there's a rough side and a smooth side on the nail, and the bevel is on the rough side of the nail. So you could have the nails in your mouth and you pick one out, you feel which is the rough side. You immediately knew how it went into the shoe with the rough side to the inside. So when you drove this nail in the bevel, the nail would curl and come out through the wall of the hoof. These are all different shoeing tools. I won't go through them. But I have a couple different types of shoes here. These, in fact, are horseshoes. These are, anybody know? Mule shoes, yes. Oxen shoes, yes. They put shoes on oxen with a split hoof. Switch. Hey, you're really good. Whenever you took your horse to the blacksmith shop or the farrier to get shod, there were always little kids running around. Keep them out of trouble, you gave them this. And their job was to chase the flies off the horse while the guy was shoeing the horse. It's called a switch, and it's actually made from a horse's tail. These are also, this is an old farrier's tool. It's got like a chisel end here. We held it like this, and you had the horse's hoof between your legs. This was to shave off the bottom of the horse's foot. This is called a buttress. Nowadays, you have a pair of nippers like this with real sharp cutting edges that you use for trimming the feet. This has got like a serrations there. A flute. Yeah, it's actually a tooth flute. When a horse chews a lot of hay in that, it grinds off the teeth, and the edges roll over and they get real sharp edges, and it either cuts their tongue or their cheek. So occasionally you have to file off those sharp edges so that they'll eat properly. So I can't imagine going in their mouth, to knock those corners off.
A horse's tooth keeps growing, right?
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah.
I mean, they can tell the age of a horse by its teeth. Is
Yeah.
that correct?
Yeah, by how many teeth it has. I can't, but they might.
Okay.
This is obviously a boot for a horse. What it is, it's actually called a poultice boot or a medicine boot. If you had an infected foot that you had to keep it clean and have medicine packed in it, you could do that and strap it onto their foot. This has a steel plate in the bottom. This is a tie weight. Let's say you went somewhere to the doctor with your horse and carriage, and you get there and they don't have a hitching post to tie up. A lot of horses were trained to tie to a drop weight like this. You could tie, you'd snap a short line, you know, from the halter and tie it down to this. The horse could easily drag this away, but they were trained to tie to this drop weight. You know, so that was your anchor over there. When you were in the carriage, of course, you know, if it was cold weather, you had various lap robes to keep yourself warm. These are typically made out of wool. This one has a tag somewhere, I think. Huh?
Smells like mothballs.
Oh yeah, I keep it in a chest with mothballs. This one has a tag on it. At public sales, you'd see a lot of these lap robes, and they always had a black background, and the other half of the other side of it is usually a solid color. And a lot of them are moth-eaten, like because they're wool. But occasionally you'd find some that are in really good shape with nice, vivid coloring of flowers. Occasionally you'll find them with animals in the print, and even more rarely you'll find them with a horse print on them. I only ever bought lap robes unless they were basically virtually perfect and, you know, nice and colorful. I have one robe in my collection. We were up at Howard Geisinger's festival one year, and an elderly lady came up to me and she saw the stuff we had there, and she says, "I have something at home you might be interested in." So I went down to visit her at her home in Bland, and here she had, she said it was a buffalo robe from her great-grandparents. I bought it. I don't know if it's a buffalo robe, but it's maybe twice the size of this. The edges, on the one side, there's a hide with, you know, fairly long hair. I don't know if it's buffalo or what it is. The other side is a wool print, and the edges of the thing have scallops in red and green felt all the way around the edges. If we ever have an antiques roadshow that comes in the area, I want to take that there and see what that thing is. In the carriage, of course, if it was winter, this is a carriage heater. Charcoal brick, you light the brick. Close this, you could adjust how much air it got. You put this on the floor in the carriage, you could put your feet on it, wrap the lap robe around you, and that was your heater. Here's another style of heater. This one's a little bit cheaper version. This one you couldn't adjust how much air it got. Here's a unique item. No, it's got a 12 top on it. Wouldn't support your weight.
It's a one-seater.
Put your feet on
Nope. This has got an 1895 date on it here. When the two adults sat in the carriage, there was no room for the kid to sit, okay? So you could put this between your legs on the seat, and then the kid sat on here. So this is called a third seat, okay? Here's another one. This one has an interesting story to it. When I bought this, these things were bent around, and I knew what it was when I bought it, but I couldn't figure out how to put it together. And the one year when we were up at Howard Geisinger's festival, there was a little black boy there that was running around in the carriages, and I was keeping a close eye on him because he was bouncing in the carriages and stuff like that. And he went over to the one carriage and he said to me, he saw the whip for the carriage. He says, "I see the antenna, but where's the radio?" So I was keeping a close eye on him. Next thing I know, he's fooling around with this thing, and next thing he says to me, he says, "Hey mister, look at this. This makes a nice seat." So he figured out how to set it up. On this table here, we have bridle rosettes. Some of these are World War I Army bridle rosettes. There's a lot of glass ones with horses. These are baubles that go on the harness for the driving harness. These are eagles that go on the bow of sleighs. A whip socket. These are brackets that go on the carriage to mount lamps on them. Here's the carriage lamp, this tapered thing. Actually, the nut there, or the bolt there is turned in, so this doesn't go in there. They mount on this. Excuse me a minute.
That goes with the carriage too.
That tastes good. I have two styles of carriage lamps here. This is your common buggy lamp. These are candle powered. This unscrews here. And there's a cloth bag here with a spring in it. So you put your candle in there, put this back in here. So and then you could light this from the back here. And so there was one little flame there, and that was your light that you had for your carriage. And as the candle burned down, of course, the spring pushed it back up. Some of your carriage lamps had kerosene pots in them. Here's a little kerosene pot with a wick. You'd fill that up with kerosene and put it in here, and this was your light then for your carriage. This is called a saddle chime. That one picture I showed you, I showed you where it mounted on the horse's harness. You know, you're driving a horse and you're continually listening to that. Like, oh my God. These are shaft chimes for on a sleigh. Here's strap bells. These are called belly bands, or more appropriately, I think they hung around the neck, because most of these are not long enough to go around the whole belly of a horse. These are graduated bell straps here. They start out with a big bell and go smaller. Hi, baby. And over here we have a bunch of carriage. Here's on occasion, you had to take the wheel off and re-grease the wheel. In the bag here are little leather washers. You'd put a washer on the axle side, put the wheel on, and then another washer, and then of course you had a nut that went on the axle, and then you had a wrench to take that nut off. These were various style jacks for lifting the carriage up so you could take the wheel off. This particular one, you pull this up till it hits the axle, and then you push this down and it would go over center and lock it. A lot of these jacks have dates on it. I think this one's 1897. This one's 1901. This one jacks up like that. That one jacks very similar. This one, when you went to local farm sales years ago, they sold these as wagon jacks. It is a wagon jack. What it really is a Conestoga wagon jack. And a lot of these came with dates on them. They're very robust. This one has an 1860 date. A lot of them have dates on them. I think the earliest one that I have is dated 1792. I think this is the latest one I have. This one's dated 1860. But you could jack the Conestoga wagon up here. Jack it up. And the last item I have here is this sleigh runner. In the winter, you could take your wheels off your carriage, and this would be reamed out to fit your axle, and then you put the nut back on there so you could convert your carriage from a four-wheeled vehicle into a steerable sled. There's 4 of these. They came in a set. All right, so that's it for show and tell, and that basically concludes my presentation. Yes.
Did you know Robert and Barbara Smoyer?
No, they're Diefenbachs were in there, Gladfelders, Kuglers. Most of the people that were in that club were actually out of Lancaster and Lebanon County. Yeah, that would have been pretty far north. Yeah.
No, my apologies. I didn't realize this was filmed.
I was actually
I never saw them like this, and I didn't realize what it was.
Oh yeah,
It's a computer.
this would have been in
It's
the
got a chip inside
70s
it
and 80s,
someplace.
1970s, 1980s.
That's incredible. Yeah. I'm sorry. I walked right. I could have just went bent down. I know, right? Ignorance. I'm sorry.
About the era that I did not know much about, and so I appreciate it. And it is interesting when I see the horse and buggies on the road, because I do think about, like you were showing the heater.
Oh yeah.
I'd be freezing on there.
Well, they have batteries in there now.
Now they
I'm
have,
sure they have.
right, it's a
They
lot
have,
of
they have
different.
fans under the seat blowing hot air out.
All the things that you showed us, very well appreciated, and I want to thank you on behalf of the Kutztown Historical Society and those that are here today. We thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure.
Any additional questions, please feel
How
free.
does a horse differentiate between a gas and a diesel tractor?
Don't ask me.
I was trying to, is it the
A
sound?
diesel motor makes a lot more rattling noise,
Okay.
and I don't know if that's what upset her or what, but she did not like diesel tractors, and I knew that well in advance.
And then the tractor stopped to see if it could help, right?
No, he kept going, thank goodness.
Well, I have a bearskin flat robe. It's fabric on the back, and there's bearskin on the front. I was wondering if that might be similar to what you described that woman.
It might be. I'm not sure. When I bought that robe from that elderly lady, she said it was a buffalo robe, but she also told me it was from upstate New York, so it might actually be a bearskin.
Because I have a bearskin one at home.
Okay, all right.
Buffalo isn't upstate New York.
They're what?
Buffalo isn't upstate New York.
Is not upstate New York. Is that what you're saying?
Buffalo.
Buffalo is.
Oh, the city of Buffalo. Right, that one went over my head.
I had missed that historically.
Yeah.
Why were they using bells on the horses? What was the practical reason?
The bells were usually, my understanding is the bells were used in winter, and the main well, one of the reasons is, one obvious reason is for decoration, I guess, but a horse moving through the snow on a sled makes absolutely no noise, and you're out there and it's dark, so if you got bells on, you're going to know that there's somebody else around. So supposedly that was the reason they put bells on the vehicles. Now that's one of the things I was told. I mean, I obviously don't know firsthand.
And the horses didn't mind?
No, these saddle chimes here, when we do a wedding and we have these on, this is right behind the horse's ears. She never seemed to mind them. I would wear earplugs because the other thing you got to remember is, I always told my wife, I think a horse is the dumbest animal God ever created, because they get the weirdest diseases and stuff like that, like no other animal gets. It's unreal, you know. And the problems they get with their feet, like, I don't know that there's another animal that goes through that.
Hey Ron,
Yeah.
the carriage wheels seem pretty spindly. How often would they break if like hitting a chalk pole or something like that? Or are they pretty resistant
Well,
to that?
your commercial vehicles had a much heavier wheel, but they still had a lot of breakdowns. And that's why on that Eastern Road, that's why Kutztown got its carriage shop here very early in the 30 years before Hamburg got one. Now these personal vehicles, you know, the roads were not very good. Yeah, I'm sure they had breakdowns. I don't know how often, but that's why you had wheelwright shops. You know, every little one-horse town had their own wheelwright shop. Kempton up there, you had Bond's blacksmith shop down across from where the one garage is there before you go across to the railroads thing. I think it's, was it Dietrich's shop?
Dietrich's is on the corner.
Yeah, right as you go around the corner,
Yeah.
at the lower end below the hotel there.
Yeah.
Well, just after you went around the corner going up, I think it's Kistler Valley Road, there was Bond's blacksmith shop there. My uncle actually worked there as a farrier.
It's still a blacksmith place.
Is it? Okay.
Yeah, Bruce Wallace.
Okay. But they, you know, they would repair the wheels there in the blacksmith shop.
Yeah.
You're welcome to come up here and look at this stuff.